The autumn wind swept across the high desert plateau, carrying the scent of sage and dust as Luke Lopez guided his horse along the rocky ridgeline overlooking Pueblo. The town sprawled below like scattered matchsticks, caught between the civilized world to the east and the tribal lands to the west. Luke knew both worlds intimately, his weather-beaten face and dark eyes reflecting his mixed heritage. Though he'd spent more recent years working as a scout for the territorial marshal's office than living among his mother's people. The setting sun painted long shadows across the landscape as Luke observed a dust cloud approaching from the north. Another supply wagon bound for Marshal Nathan Hall's office. Something about the increased frequency of these deliveries troubled him. His father Isaac's ranch lay to the west, bordering Ute territory where his mother's people still lived, and tensions had been rising steadily over the past months. Too many guns finding their way into desperate hands on both sides. Inside Pueblo's marshal's office, Luke found Nathan Hall studying a map spread across his desk, empty whiskey glass at his elbow. The marshal's steel-gray eyes lifted briefly to acknowledge Luke's entrance before returning to the parchment. "Your timing's good, Lopez. Just got word of raiders hitting homesteads out near your father's place. Might want to check on the old man." There was something in Hall's tone that set Luke's instincts humming. "Strange coincidence," Luke replied carefully, "considering I just rode past there yesterday." Everything was quiet. He studied the marshal's face, noting the slight tightening around the eyes, almost like someone's trying to stir up trouble between the settlers and the Ute. The accusation hung unspoken in the air between them. Luke had known Nathan Hall for 5 years, but lately the marshal's behavior had shifted in ways that left him unsettled. The next morning found Luke riding hard toward his father's ranch, mind churning over recent events. His sister Caroline still lived there with Isaac, helping manage the sprawling cattle operation that their father had built from nothing over 20 years ago. Their mother Eleanor had returned to her people years ago, unable to continue straddling the divide between two worlds. Now Luke feared that divide was about to become a battlefield. The Lopez Ranch came into view as Luke crested a rise, the familiar adobe walls and split-rail corrals a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. Caroline was already rushing out to meet him, her dark hair streaming behind her as she ran. The worry etched on her face confirmed his fears before she even spoke. "Luke, thank God you're here. They took them. All of them. Every rifle and pistol from the gun cabinet." Father's beside himself. Inside, Isaac Lopez sat at the heavy oak table, hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. His weathered face showed every one of his 60 years as he looked up at his son. "It was Ute warriors," he said quietly. "I recognize some of them. Your mother's sister's boys among them. But something wasn't right. They moved like they were following orders, not raiding." Luke's jaw tightened at the implications. A knock at the door had them all turning, hands instinctively moving toward weapons that were no longer there. Joshua Carter stood in the doorway, hat in hand. As Isaac's nearest neighbor and closest friend, his presence should have been reassuring, but the grim set of his mouth spoke of more troubles. "Marshal Hall's calling a meeting in town tomorrow. Says he's got a plan to deal with the Indian problem once and for all." The words landed like stones in Luke's gut. Luke spent a sleepless night in his old room, listening to the wind and weighing his options. His position as scout had given him access to the marshal's office, access that might help him understand what was really happening. But it had also shown him how deep corruption could run in a place where law was more suggestion than fact. As dawn broke, he made his decision. He would need to play both sides while belonging to neither if he hoped to prevent the coming bloodshed. The gathering in Pueblo's town hall the next morning was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Luke stood at the back, watching Marshal Hall work the crowd of angry ranchers and settlers into a frenzy with tales of savage raids and stolen weapons. But Luke's attention was on the quiet men at the edges of the room, particularly Caleb Nelson, the new deputy who seemed to appear wherever trouble was brewing lately. There was more to this than simple tribal conflicts, and Luke intended to find out what. After the town hall meeting dispersed, Luke slipped away from the crowd and made his way to the stables behind the marshal's office. The morning sun cast long shadows through the weathered boards as he pretended to check his horse while watching Deputy Nelson meet with two unfamiliar men near the loading dock. Their hushed conversation and furtive glances set Luke's instincts on edge. He recognized one man's distinctive limp. He'd seen him before, delivering supplies to both the reservation and the ranchers. The autumn wind carried fragments of their conversation, something about a shipment coming through Durango, and concerns about the Apache scouts growing suspicious. Luke kept his head down, adjusting his saddle straps with deliberate slowness as he strained to hear more. Deputy Nelson's voice carried an edge of irritation. "Keep them distracted. We can't afford any interference this close to delivery." Luke mounted up and rode out toward his father's ranch, his mind churning. The pieces were starting to fit together. The mysterious raids, the weapons appearing on both sides, the ways certain officials seemed to profit while peace crumbled. But he needed proof, something concrete enough to convince both his father's people and his mother's tribe that they were being played against each other. The ranch came into view as he crested the rise. The familiar, whitewashed buildings and corrals where he'd spent his childhood summers learning the cattle business from Nathan, his father. A figure on horseback approached from the south pasture. His sister Caroline, her dark hair catching the sunlight. Of all his siblings, she alone had inherited their mother's Apache features, though she'd chosen to remain at the ranch when their mother returned to her people. "You missed quite a show in town," Luke said, as Caroline reined up beside him. Marshal Hall's determined to convince everyone the tribe's behind the raids. He studied his sister's face, wondering how much to share of his suspicions. Caroline had contacts among both the settlers and the tribe. She might be able to help him gather information, but involving her also meant putting her at risk. Caroline's expression darkened. "Joshua rode in this morning with news from the South Range. Someone cut our fence lines again, drove off nearly 30 head. Father's furious. He's talking about organizing a patrol to catch the raiders." She paused, then added quietly, "But the cuts were too clean, Luke. Too precise. No raiding party would take the time to make cuts like that." Luke nodded slowly. "Those cattle will probably turn up in Durango, sold through legitimate channels with forged papers. Someone's profiting from this conflict, sister. And I don't think it's who everyone assumes." He described what he'd overheard behind the marshal's office, watching Caroline's eyes narrow as she made the same connections he had. "Eleanor at the general store mentioned some strange shipments coming through lately," Caroline said. "Heavy crates that arrive at odd hours, never properly documented. She's been keeping notes. Said something felt wrong about it all." She turned her horse toward the ranch house. "Come on, Father needs to hear this, and then we need to find a way to get word to Mother's people before things get worse." They found Nathan in his study, poring over ledgers with a worried frown. The ranch was bleeding money from the raids and rising tension, exactly as someone seemed to want. Luke laid out what he'd learned, watching his father's expression shift from skepticism to grave concern. Nathan had never fully accepted his wife's people, but he was no fool. He could see the pattern emerging. "We need more than suspicions," Nathan said finally, closing his ledger. "If you're right about corruption in the marshal's office, we need solid evidence before we can act. And we need to move carefully. Whoever's behind this won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens their operation." He fixed Luke with a stern gaze. "Watch yourself, son. You're in a unique position to uncover the truth, but that also makes you dangerous to them." Luke left the ranch as sunset painted the hills in golden shadow, his saddlebags packed for several days' travel. He had a contact in Durango who might be able to help him track the mysterious shipments, and Caroline would keep watch over things at home while maintaining communication with their mother's people through Eleanor's store. The pieces were in place. Now he just had to stay alive long enough to expose the truth. The trail to Durango wound through rocky passes and deep arroyos, forcing Luke to pick his way carefully in the growing darkness. He'd traveled this route many times, but never with such weight on his shoulders. Every shadowy outcropping could hide a watchful eye. Every distant sound might signal danger. The arms dealers had proven they could reach into both worlds he straddled, his father's ranch and his mother's tribe. And Luke knew he was gambling with more than just his own life. The cool night air carried whispers of sage and juniper as Luke made camp in a sheltered hollow, well off the main trail. As he tended his small fire, his thoughts drifted to Eleanor's store and the coded messages she helped pass between the scattered bands of his mother's people. The trader woman had been a friend to both communities for years, her shop serving as neutral ground where information could flow freely. Now that channel might prove vital to preventing bloodshed. Dawn found Luke already riding, the early light revealing fresh wagon tracks cutting across his path. Too heavy for typical trade goods, too recent to be anything but suspicious. Luke Lopez rode hard through the scrubland between Tucson and Pueblo, his mixed heritage written in the sharp angles of his face and the deep bronze of his skin. The leather of his scout's gear creaked with each stride as his horse picked its way through the rocky terrain. Behind him, dust devils danced across the boundary between the Arizona and New Mexico territories, a fitting metaphor for his own existence, straddling two worlds that seemed determined to tear themselves apart. At the Carter family ranch, his father Nathan's sprawling operation that marked the edge of settled territory, Luke discovered fresh tracks leading toward the disputed grazing lands. Cattle lay dead in the dry creek bed, their bodies riddled with arrows that Luke immediately recognized as too perfectly crafted. No warrior would waste their finest arrows on livestock. Someone wanted this to look like a raid by his mother's people. Sheriff Isaac Hall met him at the ranch house, already writing his report condemning the local Apache band. The lawman's tin star caught the afternoon sun as he gestured emphatically, but Luke noticed how Hall's eyes never quite met his own. 3 raids this month, Lopez. Your father's neighbors are demanding action. Either your mother's people back down, or there'll be blood. Luke's jaw tightened as he dismounted. Those arrows were bought from Caleb Allen's trading post in Pueblo. My uncle would never authorize raids with store-bought weapons. But even as he spoke, Luke caught sight of Eleanor Carter, his father's new wife, watching from behind the curtains, her pale face drawn with worry. She had never been comfortable with Luke's presence at the ranch. In town, Luke found Joshua Nelson holding court at the saloon, the arms dealer's smooth voice carrying over the piano music as he described the savage attacks to a rapt audience. Nelson's eyes glittered when he spotted Luke, and his smile never wavered. Awful business with your father's cattle. I've got a shipment of rifles coming in, if the ranchers are interested in protecting their herds. Caroline Lopez, Luke's mother, waited in the shadows of her brother's trading post in Pueblo. Her dark eyes, so like Luke's own, held both wisdom and warning. The young men grow restless, my son. They see the ranchers pushing closer each season, and now weapons appear in our camps. Gifts, they say, from a white man who understands our plight. But his generosity carries poison. Luke discovered manifests in Nelson's office showing weapons flowing both ways. Rifles to the ranchers, repeating pistols to the tribes, each delivery carefully timed to coincide with another mysterious raid or attack. The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity as Luke realized how long this game had been playing out, with Sheriff Hall's signature on every document. Rose Allen, Caleb's daughter who had grown up alongside Luke in these borderlands, helped him piece together the evidence. Her fingers traced the patterns of payments and shipments across carefully preserved ledgers. Father suspected something wasn't right with the trading licenses, but Hall threatened to revoke our permit if he asked questions. They're all connected, Luke. The situation exploded when Charlotte Nelson, the arms dealer's wife, was found dead in an apparent Apache raid on her private coach. But Luke had seen Charlotte arguing violently with her husband the night before, had witnessed Joshua Nelson meeting secretly with Hall and 3 unknown men in Mexican dress. The story of her death was too neat, too perfectly timed to justify the military action Hall had been pushing for. As tensions reached their breaking point, Luke discovered his father Nathan bent over his desk late one night, examining documents that proved Hall and Nelson had been systematically stealing land through fraudulent claims, using the manufactured conflict as cover. The look of shame on his father's face spoke volumes. He had suspected the truth, but chosen to look away, allowing himself to be used as a pawn in their deadly game. Luke stood in his father's study, the weight of Nathan's confession hanging heavy in the air between them. Outside, a hot wind stirred the desert scrub, carrying with it the promise of approaching storms, both natural and man-made. The documents scattered across Nathan's desk told a story of systematic corruption that stretched from Tucson to Durango, a web of deceit that had ensnared both his father's ranch and his mother's people. They've been playing us against each other from the start, Nathan said, his weathered hands trembling as he gathered the papers. Hall's men have been rustling cattle from both sides, making each blame the other. Nelson's weapons show up conveniently whenever tensions rise. I was a fool not to see it sooner. The admission carried the weight of years of prejudice and willful blindness. Luke traced the trade routes on his father's maps, seeing the pattern emerge. The fraudulent land claims formed a corridor, perfectly positioned to control both water rights and cattle trails. Every staged incident, every manipulated conflict had pushed his father's ranchers and the Apache further into Hall's grip. while Nelson's weapons kept the fear and mistrust burning. In the distance, Luke could hear the drums from his mother's people's camp. The sound carried memories of Eleanor, his Apache mother, teaching him to read both the land and men's hearts. She had warned him that living between two worlds would bring both pain and purpose. Now he understood. He was perhaps the only one who could see the full scope of Hall's machinations. At dawn, Luke rode to meet his childhood friend Isaac, now a respected voice among the younger Apache warriors. They met at the sacred pools where they had learned to swim as boys, the morning light painting the rocks in shades of blood and gold. "Your people aren't behind Charlotte's death," Luke stated, not a question but a certainty. Isaac's face remained impassive, but his eyes held a fierce intelligence. "We have watched Nelson's men. They cross the border into Mexico weekly, always returning with more than weapons. Something darker moves beneath this conflict." He passed Luke a leather pouch containing shell casings found near Charlotte's coach, ammunition that matched what Nelson sold to the ranchers, not the Apache's weapons. The revelation spurred Luke to action. He rode hard for Pueblo, where his sister Rose worked as a telegraph operator. If anyone could help him trace the paper trail of Nelson's operation, it would be her. The town had grown tense, with armed men lounging on every corner, their rifles close at hand. Hall's influence had spread like poison through the territory. Rose's tiny telegraph office smelled of ink and dust, the familiar click of the machine a counterpoint to their hushed conversation. "The messages started changing about 6 months ago," she explained, showing him the logs. "Orders for weapons became coded references to cattle and grain, but the quantities never matched any legitimate business. As they pieced together the evidence, a pattern emerged. Nelson wasn't just selling weapons. He was moving something far more valuable through the chaos he'd created. The land claims, the staged raids, even Charlotte's death were smokescreens for an operation that stretched from Mexico to Wichita." Luke's investigation led him to Caroline, a washerwoman who cleaned the rooms at Hall's office. She had noticed the marshal burning papers late at night and collecting strange packages from Mexican writers. "Charlotte knew something," Caroline whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "She confronted Joshua about it the night she died. I heard them arguing about mines and Chinese workers." The pieces began falling into place. The fraudulent land claims weren't just about water and cattle trails. They covered old Spanish silver mines, abandoned but not exhausted. Nelson and Hall were using the conflict as cover to work the mines with smuggled labor. The weapons trade masking an even more profitable venture. Luke realized he would need proof that both sides could trust. His father's ranch hands respected him, but they were scared and angry. The Apache warriors listened to Isaac, but generations of betrayal had made them suspicious of any peace offerings from white men. The truth would have to be undeniable to overcome the hatred that Hall and Nelson had so carefully cultivated. As dusk approached, Luke watched from the hills as torchlights appeared in both his father's ranch and the Apache camp. Two communities preparing for a war that would destroy them both, unless he could find a way to expose the real enemy. Tomorrow, he would begin the dangerous work of building trust between old adversaries, knowing that Hall and Nelson would stop at nothing to protect their blood-soaked profits. Luke rode out before dawn, taking the hidden trails he'd learned from his mother's people. The morning air carried the scent of creosote and sage as he made his way toward the old mission ruins where he'd arranged to meet Isaac. His Apache brother had agreed to hear him out, but Luke knew words alone wouldn't be enough. He needed something concrete to prove the manipulation behind this brewing war. The mission's crumbling adobe walls cast long shadows in the early light. Isaac emerged from the darkness like a ghost, his face betraying no emotion. Behind him, two other Apache warriors watched silently from the shadows. Luke dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. "Thank you for coming, brother. What I have to tell you affects both our peoples." Isaac listened intently as Luke explained his discoveries about the silver mines and the arms dealer's scheme. The warrior's eyes narrowed when Luke described how Nelson had been secretly meeting with renegade Apache bands, promising them weapons while simultaneously selling guns to the ranchers. "These are serious claims," Isaac said finally. "Our people have suffered many lies from white men's tongues." Luke pulled out a worn leather journal he'd taken from Nelson's office during a late-night reconnaissance. "This is Nelson's record of his deals, both the weapons and the silver. The numbers, the dates, the locations, it's all here." But we need more. We need to catch them in the act, brother. Luke Lopez crouched behind a weathered boulder, his keen eyes scanning the moon-washed valley below, where torch flames flickered like angry fireflies around the Durango courthouse. His mother's people, the Ute, had gathered in force at the edge of town, while his father Nathan's cattle ranchers formed a tense line of armed men along Main Street. The arms dealer's plan was working perfectly. Both sides were primed for bloodshed, each believing the other responsible for recent raids and murders. Through the silver-edged darkness, Luke caught sight of Marshal Isaac Hall, conferring with the merchants who'd been stirring up trouble. Even at this distance, the glint of coins changing hands was unmistakable. Luke's jaw clenched as he watched Hall pocket what was surely another bribe from the men profiting from this manufactured conflict. The corrupt lawman had been playing both sides for months, taking money to look the other way while the merchants sold weapons to ranchers and natives alike. The cool night air carried whispered fragments of conversation up the hillside. Charlotte Allen, the schoolteacher who'd been helping Luke gather evidence against the arms dealers, slipped silently to his side. Her normally pristine dress was trail-dusty, but her eyes burned with determination as she passed him a leather portfolio. "The ledgers from Carter's store," she breathed. "Every illegal weapons sale, every bribe to the marshal's office. It's all documented." Luke's heart hammered as he thumbed through the damning papers. Here was proof that Joshua Carter and his fellow merchants had orchestrated the entire conflict, staging raids and murders while selling guns to both sides. The evidence could stop the coming bloodshed, if he could only get people to listen. A flash of movement caught his eye as Eleanor, his mother's sister, emerged from the shadows of the Ute camp below. She'd been his strongest ally among the tribe, helping him investigate while others dismissed him as too white to trust. Rising tension crackled through the valley like summer lightning. Luke could see his father Nathan Lopez at the head of the rancher's line, rifle gleaming. On the opposite side, Caleb Nelson, the Ute war chief who'd helped raise Luke after his mother's death, sat proud atop his paint horse. Both leaders were good men, manipulated into believing the worst of each other. Luke's chest ached at the thought of them dying for merchants' greed. Charlotte gripped Luke's arm as Marshal Hall began addressing the crowd, his voice carrying clearly in the still night. The lawman was spinning another tale of racial hatred and revenge, carefully crafted to push both sides over the edge into violence. Luke's fingers tightened on the ledgers. It was time to act. But a direct confrontation would likely end with him shot by one side or the other before he could reveal the truth. "The stables," Eleanor whispered, materializing beside them like a spirit. "Carter and his men keep their main weapons cache hidden there. If we can expose it now with both sides watching?" Luke nodded slowly. The arms dealers had been careful to sell their weapons in small batches, maintaining the illusion they were simple merchants. The sight of their full arsenal would raise questions neither they nor Marshal Hall could answer. Moving like shadows, Luke, Charlotte, and Eleanor worked their way down the hillside toward the stables. The smell of hay and horses grew stronger as they approached the weathered building. Through gaps in the wooden walls, Luke could see Joshua Carter and his men inside, nervously watching the gathering through the windows. They were armed to the teeth, ready to profit from whichever side emerged victorious. Luke's plan crystallized as he spotted the stable's hayloft door hanging slightly open. If they could create enough of a distraction, Eleanor could slip inside and open the main doors, revealing the weapons cache to everyone. Charlotte produced a small flask of cooking oil and several matches from her skirts. "I thought these might be useful," she said with a grim smile. Luke's respect for the schoolteacher grew. She'd clearly anticipated the need for decisive action. The next few moments passed in a blur of coordinated movement. Charlotte's strategically placed oil fires drew Carter's men to the back of the stable, while Eleanor slipped inside like a shadow. Luke positioned himself by the main doors, ready to address both sides. His heart nearly stopped when a floorboard creaked behind him and he spun to find Rose Carter, Joshua's daughter, watching him with conflicted eyes. She'd been helping her father keep the books, and had clearly had enough of the bloodshed. "Do what you need to do," Rose whispered, pressing a ring of keys into Luke's palm. "I'll make sure Marshal Hall doesn't interfere." Before Luke could respond, she was gone, moving purposefully toward where the corrupt lawman stood. Luke sent up a silent prayer of thanks as Eleanor reached the main doors. The heavy wooden barriers swung open with a groan, revealing rack upon rack of rifles, crates of ammunition, and barrels of gunpowder. enough weapons to arm half the territory. A collective gasp rose from both groups as torchlight illuminated the arsenal. Luke strode forward, ledgers held high. These weapons were sold to both sides by the same men. His voice rang out across the suddenly silent valley. The raids, the murders, all orchestrated to keep us fighting while they grew rich on our blood. He began reading from the ledgers as Charlotte and Eleanor distributed copies of the most damning pages among the crowd. The next hours were chaos as the truth emerged. Joshua Carter and his conspirators tried to flee, but were caught by united groups of ranchers and Ute warriors. Marshall Hall's attempt to rally his deputies failed when Rose Carter publicly testified about his corruption. By dawn, the arms dealers were in custody. The marshal was in chains, and former enemies were sharing coffee and conversation as the sun rose over Durango. Luke stood with his father Nathan and Caleb Nelson, watching as Charlotte organized volunteers to catalog the weapons for proper disposal. Eleanor moved among both groups, helping bridge the cultural gap with her quiet wisdom. The night's events had forged new bonds between the communities, bonds that would need careful tending, but promised a better future than the merchants' manufactured hatred. Rose approached their group, still carrying herself with dignity despite her father's arrest. "I grew up watching him twist people against each other," she said softly. "I couldn't let it continue." Luke took her hand, understanding the courage it had taken to turn against her own blood for the sake of justice. Together they watched the sunrise paint the valley in shades of hope, knowing that while old wounds would take time to heal, at least now there was a chance for true peace. The peace was fragile as morning stretched into afternoon. Luke knew that while the immediate threat had been neutralized, deeper wounds remained. The tribal elders had gathered in the valley below Durango, their council fires burning as they debated the path forward. On the ranch side, Nathan and Caleb worked to convince skeptical cattlemen that cooperation would benefit everyone. The weapons cache had revealed the scale of Marshall's operation, enough firearms to arm 3 territories. Eleanor moved between the groups with practiced grace, her weathered face showing both worry and determination. She had seen too many false starts at peace over the years, but something felt different this time. The shared danger had created unlikely allies, and Rose's brave stand against her father had shown that change was possible, even in the most entrenched hearts. Charlotte organized teams to patrol the border regions, mixing tribal scouts with ranch hands. The pairing was uncomfortable at first, but Luke noticed how the men began sharing tobacco and stories as they rode. His own mixed heritage no longer felt like a divide to bridge, but rather a strength that helped others see beyond their differences. He'd spent so long trying to choose sides, only to discover that the real path lay in bringing them together. In the afternoon, Joshua arrived from Pueblo with disturbing news. Marshall's network extended far beyond Durango, with corrupt officials in 3 territories profiting from the arms trade. The weapons they'd seized were just one shipment of many. Rose confirmed her father's ledgers showed regular deliveries to Tucson and Wichita, where other merchants fanned the flames of conflict for profit. Nathan and Caleb rode out to meet with the tribal council, leaving their weapons behind as a show of trust. Luke watched his father disappear into the valley, remembering all the times Nathan had struggled to understand his son's divided loyalties. Now, the old rancher was taking the first steps toward true understanding, guided by the very crisis that had threatened to tear them apart. Josephine arrived with supplies from town, her wagon laden with food for both camps. The shared meal became an impromptu peace council, with Eleanor and Charlotte ensuring that all voices were heard. Rose sat beside Luke, her quiet strength a reminder that change often came from unexpected sources. The daughter of the man who had profited from division was now instrumental in building bridges. As evening approached, riders arrived from outlying ranches and tribal camps, drawn by word of the gathering. Luke recognized faces he'd seen on both sides of past conflicts, men who had shot at each other now sharing coffee and wary conversation. The old hatreds weren't gone, but they had been exposed as the manipulated things they were, manufactured by men like Marshall who profited from others' pain. Caroline, who had lost family in previous conflicts, stood to address the gathering. Her words, translated by Eleanor, spoke of shared grief and the possibility of a different future. The tribal elders nodded, recognizing in her pain a mirror of their own losses. It was a moment Luke had never thought to see, the beginning of real understanding between peoples who had been taught to fear each other. The night deepened, and plans were made. Joshua would ride to Wichita to alert authorities there, while Charlotte organized a larger force to track down the remaining weapons caches. The tribal warriors would work alongside ranch posses, their combined knowledge of the territory making them a formidable team against the remaining arms merchants. Luke and Rose would lead a group to Tucson, following the paper trail in Marshall's ledgers. The merchant's daughter knew her father's codes and could unravel the network he'd built. It would be dangerous. There were powerful men who wouldn't want their profitable wars disrupted, but the alternative was letting the hatred rebuild itself, one gunshot at a time. As the stars emerged over Durango, Luke stood with Rose on a ridge overlooking both camps. Below, the fires burned together, no longer separated by fear and mistrust. There would be setbacks and struggles ahead, but the path was clear now. His father's ranch hands and his mother's people had found common ground in their shared desire for peace and in exposing the true enemies who had kept them apart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, watching the mingled shadows of cowboys and tribal warriors moving between the fires, Luke finally felt whole. He was no longer torn between worlds, but rather a bridge between them, helping to build something new from the ashes of manufactured hatred. Rose squeezed his hand, and together they watched the night deepen over a valley where peace had finally taken root. Luke Lopez rode hard through the pre-dawn darkness, his mind racing faster than his horse's hooves against the dusty earth. The evidence he'd gathered against Marshal Nathan Hall was damning. Detailed ledgers showing weapon sales to both sides, telegrams arranging accidents to inflame tensions, and witness statements from terrorized townsfolk in Pueblo who'd seen the lawman's true nature. Behind him, the sound of pursuit grew louder. The marshal's deputies would have discovered his break-in at the office by now. Luke had known the risks when he'd decided to expose the corruption, but seeing those documents had confirmed his worst fears about how the violence between his father's ranch and his mother's people had been orchestrated from the start. His father, Isaac Lopez, lay wounded back at the ranch house, shot by raiders who'd struck just hours after Luke had refused to help the marshal handle the Indian problem. His mother's people were being blamed, but Luke had recognized the masked men, all deputies who frequented the marshal's office. The pieces had finally clicked into place. The canyon ahead offered his only chance. Luke urged his horse toward the narrow passage where the towering rock walls would force his pursuers into single file. His mixed heritage had always left him caught between two worlds, but now that very position had allowed him to see the larger picture that others missed. Both sides were being played. Caroline Allen, the newspaper editor's daughter who'd helped him gather evidence, waited at their arranged meeting spot with fresh horses. Her father, Joshua Allen, had been murdered 6 months ago after beginning to investigate the marshal's activities. Caroline had continued his work in secret, building a network of allies including Eleanor Nelson, a telegraph operator who intercepted suspicious messages. "They're right behind me," Luke called out as he dismounted. Caroline already had the fresh mount ready. "Did you get the documents to Caleb?" he asked, referring to the federal investigator who'd been quietly building a case. Caroline nodded as she helped transfer his saddlebags. "He's headed to Tucson with everything, but Luke, there's more." Eleanor intercepted a telegram. "The marshal's planning something big tonight." The sound of approaching riders echoed off the canyon walls. Luke swung onto the fresh horse as Caroline mounted her own. "My father's ranch," he said grimly. "He's going to hit it tonight, blame it on the tribe. Start a war neither side can back down from." Caroline's eyes widened. "How can you be sure?" "Because I know where he keeps his real records, and I know what's in them." They rode hard through the morning, taking back trails and dry creek beds to avoid the search parties. Luke's mind raced through possibilities. The ranch was defenseless with his father wounded. The tribe was already on edge after the recent raids. If the marshal's men struck now, wearing war paint and native dress as they had before, the powder keg would explode. Rose Carter, his father's housekeeper who'd helped raise Luke after his mother's death, met them at the back door of the ranch house. "Your father's fever's broken," she whispered. "But there are men watching the house. They've been there since dawn." Luke nodded grimly. "Get everyone into the root cellar. Caroline, help her. I need to reach the tribe before nightfall." The medicine woman, Charlotte, his mother's sister, listened with grave attention as Luke explained in their native tongue. He showed her the documents he'd kept copies of, the evidence of the marshal's manipulation. "Both sides have been deceived," he finished. "But together we can expose the truth." Charlotte studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I will speak to the council, but you must bring proof they cannot deny." The moonless night worked in Luke's favor as he crept through the brush toward the marshal's office in Durango. He'd tracked 3 of the corrupt lawmen to this location, where they likely kept their incriminating records. The building sat dark and quiet, but Luke knew better than to trust appearances. Years of scouting had taught him patience, and he waited until the guard changed before making his move. Inside, the musty office yielded what he needed: ledgers showing weapons sales to both sides, forged orders bearing the marshal's seal, and detailed plans to incite violence between the tribe and ranchers. Luke's hands trembled as he gathered the evidence. His father Nathan had nearly died because of these men's greed. His mother's people faced destruction, all for profit. Dawn was breaking as Luke rode hard for the meeting place where Charlotte had agreed to bring the tribal council. Caroline waited there with his father Nathan, who still looked pale but stood straight-backed beside Rose. The ranch hands Isaac and Caleb had positioned themselves on the ridgeline, watching for any sign of the marshal's men. "The council approaches," Charlotte announced in English, emerging from the morning mist with the tribal elders. Luke recognized the gravity of this moment. Never had the two groups met in peace like this. He laid out the documents, translating carefully between languages as he explained the deception. Nathan's face darkened with anger while the tribal leaders murmured among themselves. Suddenly, Josephine, one of Rose's kitchen helpers, came galloping up on a lathered horse. "Marshal's men riding in from Pueblo," she called out. "At least 20, armed for war." Luke saw his careful plans threatening to unravel. But before panic could take hold, his father stepped forward, addressing the tribal council directly. "My son speaks truth for both peoples," Nathan declared, his voice carrying across the morning air. "I offer my ranch as sanctuary until we can expose these criminals. Whatever comes, we face it together." Charlotte translated, and Luke felt his heart swell as the elders nodded in agreement. Years of mistrust began to crack. They barely had time to move everyone to the defensible position of the ranch before dust clouds announced the marshal's approach. Luke positioned the warriors and ranch hands carefully, using every scrap of cover. Caroline and Rose organized the women to tend the wounded they all knew would come. His two worlds were finally fighting as one. The battle, when it came, was brief but fierce. The corrupt lawmen, expecting to find the tribe and ranchers at each other's throats, instead faced a unified defense. Caught in a crossfire between skilled warriors and experienced ranch hands, their attack faltered. Luke himself captured the marshal, using his tracking skills to outflank the man's position. In the aftermath, as the prisoners were bound and the wounded treated, Luke found himself standing between his father and Charlotte. Blood from both peoples had mixed in the earth today, but not in violence, in defense of truth and justice. Eleanor, the young tribal healer working alongside Caroline to tend the injured, symbolized the possibility of a different future. The circuit judge arrived from Tucson 3 days later, accompanied by federal marshals. Luke testified in both English and his mother's tongue, ensuring both sides of the story were heard. The evidence proved overwhelming. The corrupt marshal and his conspirators would face justice, while the weapons they'd sold would be destroyed. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Luke watched his father and Charlotte share a pipe of peace on the ranch house porch. Rose brought out coffee and her famous cornbread, serving everyone without distinction. The tribal elders had accepted Nathan's invitation to stay until their wounded healed. And already new understandings were growing. Luke felt the weight of his mother's medallion against his chest, the one Charlotte had given him years ago. He no longer had to choose between worlds. He could bridge them, using the wisdom of both to build something stronger. Caroline touched his arm gently, and he smiled. The path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time it was clear. In the weeks that followed, Luke worked tirelessly to forge lasting bonds between the two communities. The ranch became a meeting ground where tribal hunters shared tracking techniques with the cowboys, while Nathan's men demonstrated modern farming methods that could help the tribe through harsh winters. Caroline proved instrumental, using her education to document both cultures' medicinal knowledge, creating a bridge of mutual understanding through healing practices. The tribal council's decision to establish permanent trading relations with the ranch sparked controversy in Durango, where some merchants feared losing business. But Luke's measured diplomacy, backed by his father's influence and the federal marshal's continued support, helped ease tensions. He spoke at town meetings, sharing stories of how cooperation had already prevented cattle rustlers from exploiting the former divisions between ranch and tribal lands. Rose and Charlotte worked together to establish a school that would teach both native and settler children, preserving important traditions while preparing them for the changing territory. The sight of young ones learning each other's languages and games became a powerful symbol of what was possible when old prejudices were set aside. Eleanor, who had initially resisted such changes, became one of the school's strongest advocates after seeing her grandchildren thrive there. When news arrived that the corrupt marshal and his conspirators had been sentenced in Tucson, Luke felt a chapter closing. The weapons they'd sold had been melted down, transformed into tools for the school and ranch. Caroline suggested preserving one rifle, mounted above the ranch house fireplace, as a reminder of how close they'd come to destroying each other. Luke agreed, though he added his mother's beadwork to the display, symbolizing the beauty that could emerge from conflict. As spring arrived, bringing new growth to the high desert, Luke and Caroline married in a ceremony that blended both worlds. The tribal elders blessed their union with sacred smoke while Nathan read from his family Bible. The celebration lasted 3 days, with feasting, storytelling, and dancing that drew people from as far as Pueblo and Wichita.